Not too long ago, someone asked me what my podcast was about. I told her it was a science education podcast that was all about evolution. And she said, "Do you mean the theory about evolution, like Charles Darwin?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's exactly like that." "Why teach evolution?" she wanted to know. Why evolution? Now, that's a good question. Why is this show about evolution when, I really could have done a show about so many other things related to science? I could have made a show about the beginning of the universe, and I did consider that at one time. Or even about quantum physics. Or I could have done a philosophy podcast about free will, which is another favorite topic of mine. Artificial intelligence as well. I could have done a podcast about that. I even drafted a book on that topic. And yet, my show is about evolution. And this episode marks episode number 135. That's 135 shows on this topic. Now, if I ran them back to back, I could fill an entire day of content. And I'm not done yet. So, back to my friend's question. Why teach evolution? Well, this is why. I hope she's listening.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
When I was young, I marveled at the world outside my window. When I was told that we need oxygen to live, well, my 6-year-old self thought it came from the clouds. Then I learned in a science class that oxygen was produced primarily by trees and plants through photosynthesis. They convert carbon dioxide and sunlight into oxygen and glucose. The carbon dioxide they take in through their leaves. So I wanted to know, where does the carbon dioxide come from? Among other things I learned, it comes from us and from other animals. It's a byproduct of our respiration. We breathe it out. And that amazed me. I thought long and hard about that. To my young mind, it kind of meant that someone or something must have designed it to be that way. And there were other mysteries that my younger self struggled to understand, like faces. Most every animal on Earth has 2 eyes, from snakes to koala bears, and also tongues and teeth, some sharper than others. And we all have stomachs to process food, and we all have limbs. Well, snakes don't, but then I learned that some snakes, like boas and pythons, do in fact have remnants of hind leg bones buried in their bodies near their tail, and that blew my mind. If they had hind legs, they must have used them at one time, right? Whales have these too. The world was full of things that seemed to fit together and yet were so different. And then I was introduced to the theory of evolution by natural selection, again in a classroom. And things began to click. Not immediately, mind you. It took years for those early concepts that were first heard in a classroom to draw me into their world. But when they did, when I began to crack open those first few books in my spare time to really see what this was all about, only then did it begin to make sense. Who was this Charles Darwin I'd heard so much about? It was his insight into the world and its diversity that helped explain our biological past. And not just our own past, really the past of everything, from the smallest ant to the elephant. If you traveled back far enough, you would find a common ancestor to tie them all together. The oak tree in my backyard, the one which the squirrels love to collect acorns from, it has its roots not only in the ground, but in a distant past that's actually shared with those squirrels. They're related as well. They're sharing a common ancestor that lived in a eukaryotic form over 1 billion years ago. Darwin realized this as well. He wrote about it long before DNA or genetics, or even the discovery of human and pre-human fossils in the sands and caves of Africa and elsewhere. Darwin did this by observing nature and by comparing subtle differences in animals that both explained and predicted their features as it relates to their environment. Need to get to the nectar in a flower with a, say, long nectar spur? Well, for an animal to do so, say a moth, it would need to have evolved a very long proboscis, or a tongue, to reach that nectar. And Darwin wondered about this. And 20 years later, in 1882, that moth was found, the hawk moth. To get to the nectar at the end of a foot-long flower, the hawk moth has a foot-long tongue. It all makes sense when you consider evolution by natural selection. All of it. When it all began to come together for me, I looked at the world in an entirely new way. When I encounter an ant in my kitchen, my first impulse isn't to kill it, it's to move it outside. Unfortunately, the same empathy isn't extended to the mosquitoes, which are drawn to the carbon dioxide I produce, as well as the heat and sweat from my body. The same CO2 that trees and plants thrive on, mosquitoes can detect through tiny receptors from as far as 50 meters, or 164 feet away. They're like tiny kamikaze machines molded by their environment to do what they do best, which is to force me to leave my favorite seat outside and to take my book to someplace safer. It's fair to say, my view of the world and even my place in it has evolved as well, so much so that I wanted to share it, which is what I'm doing right now with you. It led me to produce this show, which began in 2014, and to the book I wrote that was published in 2022. If I can extend the same amazement and awe that I feel when I look at the world on a quiet day to you, then I've accomplished my goal. What if, just as a thought experiment, we removed evolution from the equation? What if life on Earth didn't evolve from one single filament, as Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, once so eloquently put it in his great work called Zoonomia? Now, set aside the fact that he wrote that 65 years before his grandson published on the origin of species. Now, suppose there was no single filament to start it all. Instead, there was a bunch of unrelated circumstances and unrelated activities that just so happened to form into the diversity of life that we see around us. Animal behaviors were shaped in this supposed world by chance and not nature. New features yet before unseen in a species occurred simply because they occurred and were not inherited. No genes to pass traits along, no variation, no struggles to survive or adaptations to allow for the ability to survive. Imagine a hominin river with no tributaries, just a puddle with Homo sapiens paddling their boats in circles, wondering how they got there and why they even have arms to hold their oars. Never mind where their oars even came from. It all just happened. As evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky once wrote in 1973, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. The wonderful thing is, the theory of evolution by natural selection is so simple, it's beautiful. The only difficult part is comprehending the vast amounts of time it takes to work its magic. A new species won't pop into existence overnight. It takes millions of years, billions of years. I'll hand the mic over to Bill Nye, the science guy, for a moment.
This process that brought us to be is billions of years old. And it's just really hard to get your mind around what that means. Billion years, 65 million years. And the other thing that's just out of our everyday experience as people, we design things and make them. We decide how big the piece of paper is. We decide how large our handwriting is going to be. Then we make an organization chart for our corporation, and then we hire people, and it's top down. It's idea down. But evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution is bottom up. Evolution is in the poetic sense, organic, in the chemical sense, literally organic.
It took 3.5 billion years to get from that single filament of Erasmus Darwin's to where we are now. And by we, I don't mean you and me, although it includes us. I mean everything. 1,000 years is almost too great a time to imagine. 1,000,000 even worse. 1,000,000,000 is, well, it's incomprehensible. But it takes that long for an accumulation of inheritable traits to account for the diversity and abundance of species around us. And it will continue to do so for the next few billion years, or until our sun burns out. But I'm sure if it's happening here, it's happening elsewhere in the universe, and I can only imagine what that might look like. So, back to that question. Why teach evolution? Well, I hope this episode helps to shed a little bit of light on that. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and if you find value in this show, please consider supporting it at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to keep the show alive and without ads, and I can only do so with your assistance. Help spread the word, share the show with your friends, and at evolutiontalk.com you'll find more information, some recommended books, and also ways to contact me. I'd always love to hear from you. And I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.